Alexa, tell me a joke.
What's a pirate's favorite letter?
P?
You might think it's R, but his first love be the C.
Hey there, Shankar Vedantam here. Do you have a smart speaker in your house or a Roomba? Do you dictate text messages to Siri? On this week's Radio Replay, we bring you a combination of two of our favorite tech-themed podcast episodes from 2017, Who We Are at 2 a.m. and Could You Kill a Robot? The next 50 minutes are all about our changing relationships with technology. One note, though, this episode includes a racial epithet and discussions about pornography. Now to the show. Actually, hang on. Alexa, one more joke, please.
How do you win over a chocolate lover? Keep some Twix up your sleeves.
This is Hidden Brain. I'm Shankar Vedantam. In the 2013 movie Her,
Good morning, Theodore.
Good morning.
a man named Theodore falls in love.
You want to try getting out of bed? Get up!
You're too funny.
The object of his affection is named Samantha. Samantha isn't human.
Theodore, I saw in your emails that you'd gone through a breakup recently.
You're kind of nosy.
Am I? You'll get used to it.
She's a computer, or more precisely, an operating system with a sultry female voice. Over time, the relationship hits the usual hurdles. He finds out she isn't being faithful.
Are you in love with anyone else?
I've been trying to figure out how to talk to you about this.
How many others?
641.
Now, this premise may seem ridiculous, outlandish. But today on Hidden Brain, we explore how humans are forming increasingly interdependent relationships with machines. Our closest confidants, our wisest teachers, and our most dependable friends increasingly have electricity running through their silicon veins. They are the ones we turn to when we're in trouble, when we have a question about something embarrassing or deeply personal. Exhibit A in this new kind of relationship? Google.
Because there's just some things you just can't ask a real person in real life, and you need to ask Google.
Because it's completely anonymous and there are no judgments attached.
Google knows everything.
I agree to that.
Every time we type into a search box, we reveal something about ourselves. As millions of us look for answers to questions or things to buy or places to meet friends, our searches produce a map of our collective hopes, fears, and desires. My guest today is Seth Stephens-Davidowitz. He used to be a data scientist at Google, and he's the author of the book Everybody Lies: Big Data, New Data, and What the Internet Can Tell Us About Who We Really Are. Seth, welcome to Hidden Brain.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Shankar.
So, Seth, we all know that Google handles billions of searches every day, but one of the insights you've had is that the reason Google knows a lot about us is not just because of the volume of search terms, but because people turn to Google as they might turn to a friend or a confidant.
That's exactly right. I think there's something very comforting about that little white box that people feel very comfortable telling things that they may not tell anybody else about their sexual interests, their health problems, their insecurities. And using this anonymous aggregate data, we can learn a lot more about people than we've really ever known.
And one of the ways we can learn a lot more about people is through these very strange correlations. You find, for example, there's a relationship between the unemployment rate and the kinds of searches people make online.
Yeah, I was looking at what searches correlate most with the unemployment rate, and I was expecting something like new jobs or unemployment benefits, but during the time period I looked at, the single search that was most highly correlated with the unemployment rate was a pornography site. And you can imagine that if a lot of people are out of work, they have nothing to do during the day, they may be more likely to look at porn sites. Another search that was high on the list was solitaire. So again, when people are out of work, they're kind of bored, they do leisure activities, and potentially this measure of how much leisure there is on the internet may help us know how many people are out of work on a given day.
And of course, this sort of helps us reconsider what we think of as data. So when we think about the unemployment rate, as you say, our normal approach is to say how many people are still in jobs, let's track down all the jobs. This is coming at the question entirely differently.
Yeah, I think the traditional way to collect data was to send a survey out to people and have them answer questions, check boxes. There are lots of problems with this approach. Many people don't answer surveys, and many people lie to surveys. So the new era of data is kind of looking through all the clues that we leave, many of them not as part of questions or as part of surveys, but just clues we leave as we go through our lives.
One of the important differences between mining this kind of data and the responses we get on surveys has to do with how people report their sexual orientation. I understand that the kind of queries that you see on Google might reveal something quite different than if you ask people if they're gay.
That's right. If you ask people in surveys today in the United States, about 2.5% or 3% of men say that they're primarily attracted to men. And this number is far higher in certain states where tolerance to homosexuality is greater. So there are a lot more gay men, according to surveys, in California than in Mississippi. But if you look at search data for gay male pornography, it's a tiny bit higher in California, but not that much higher. And overall, about 5% of male pornography search is for gay porn. So almost twice as high as the numbers you get in surveys.
Your research has important implications for a topic that we've looked at a lot on Hidden Brain, the topic of implicit bias. People aren't always aware of the biases they hold, and so scientists have had to find clever ways to unearth these biases. You think that Google searches can reveal some forms of implicit bias?
That's right. So one I look at is the questions that parents have about their children. If you ask many parents today, they would say that they treat their sons and daughters equally, that they're equally excited about their intellectual potential, equally concerned about maybe their weight problems. But if you aggregate everybody's Google searches, you see large differences in gender, that when parents in the United States ask questions starting, "Is my son?" they're much more likely to use words such as gifted or a genius than they would in a search starting, "Is my daughter?" When parents in the United States search, "Is my daughter?" they're much more likely to complete it with, "Is my daughter overweight?" or "Is my daughter ugly?" So parents are much more excited about the intellectual potential of their sons and much more concerned about the physical appearance of their daughters.
Before I get to the next question, Seth, I just want to give a warning to our listeners. This next section is going to involve a discussion regarding the N-word. Seth, you report that in some states after Barack Obama was first elected president, there were more Google searches for a certain racist term than searches for first black president.
I think there is a disturbing element to some of this search data where in the United States today, many people, and maybe this is a good thing, don't feel comfortable sharing that they have racist thoughts or racist feelings. But on Google, they do make these searches in strikingly high frequency. I need to use sorted language to this. The measure is the percent of Google searches that include the word. And these searches are predominantly searches looking for jokes, mocking African Americans. I should clarify, this is not searches for rap lyrics, which tend to use the word, the ending in A. But if you look at the racist search volumes, I think if you had asked me, based on everything I had read about racism in the United States, I would have thought that racism in the United States predominantly concentrated in the South, that really the big divide in the United States when it comes to racism is South versus North. But the Google data reveals that's not really the case, that racism is actually very, very high in many places in the North, places like Western Pennsylvania or Eastern Ohio or industrial Michigan or rural Illinois or upstate New York. The real divide these days when it comes to racism is not North versus South, it's East versus West. There's much higher racism east of the Mississippi than west of the Mississippi.
So besides just saying, we know that there are these patterns of racist searches in different parts of the country, you're actually saying you can do more than that. You can actually predict how different parts of the country might vote in a presidential election based on the kind of Google searches you see in different parts of the country.
Yeah, well, the first thing I found is that there was a large correlation between racist search volume and parts of the country where Obama did worse than other Democratic candidates had done. So Barack Obama was the first major party general election nominee who was African American. And you see a clear relationship that Obama lost large numbers of votes in parts of the country where there are high racist search volumes, and other researchers have found, such as Nate Silver at 538 and Nate Cohn at the New York Times, that there was a large correlation between racist search volumes and support for Donald Trump and the Republican Party, that parts of the country that made racist searches in high numbers were much more likely to support Donald Trump. And this relationship was much stronger than really any other variable that they tested.
I'm wondering how you try and understand that kind of information. It's hard not to listen to what you're saying and draw sort of what seems to be a superficial conclusion, which is that racist people vote for Donald Trump. I'm not sure. Is that what you're saying?
That's one of those things where it sounds so offensive to say it that I think everyone tiptoes around the line. I will say that the data does show strong correlation between racist searches and support for Donald Trump that is hard to explain with any other explanation. That kind of is what I'm saying. I'm not saying that everybody who supported Donald Trump is racist by any stretch of the imagination. There are plenty of people who support Donald Trump without this racist tendency, but a significant fraction of his supporters, I think, were motivated by racial animus.
Seth Stephens-Davidowitz is a former Google data scientist and the author of Everybody Lies: Big Data, New Data, and What the Internet Can Tell Us About Who We Really Are. You spend a lot of time in the book talking about sex. It turns out to be an area where marketers and companies know that what we say about ourselves is nowhere close to the truth. Most people report being not interested in pornography, but the website Pornhub reports that in 2015 alone, viewers watched 2.5 billion hours of porn, which is apparently longer than the entire amount of time that humans have been on Earth. What does this say about us? The fact that we either have very little insight about ourselves or we're actually lying through our teeth?
Yeah, I'd say we're probably lying through our teeth. I'd say that I do talk a lot about sex in this book. One thing I like to say is that big data is so powerful it turned me into a sex expert because it wasn't a natural area of expertise for me. But I do talk a lot about sexuality, and I think you do learn a lot about people that's very, very different from what they say, and kind of the weirdness at the heart of the human psyche that doesn't really reveal itself in everyday life or at lunch tables, but does reveal itself at 2 a.m. on Pornhub.
Pornography sites aren't the only ones gathering information about our sexual and romantic preferences. We now have apps like Tinder and sites like OkCupid that gather tons of data about us. As a result, these apps and sites know a lot about our romantic preferences. But for a long time, we've had a human version of big data for romance, grandma. Seth has some personal experience with this big data source. A couple of years ago, he was having Thanksgiving dinner with his family. He was 33, didn't have a date with him, and his family was trying to figure out the qualities Seth needed in a romantic partner.
My family was going back and forth. My sister was saying that I need a crazy girl because I'm crazy. My brother was saying that my sister was crazy, that I need a normal girl to balance me out, and my mom was screaming at my brother and sister that I'm not crazy, and my dad was then screaming at my mom that, of course, Seth is crazy. So it was kind of a classic Stephens-Davidowitz family Thanksgiving where everyone's just yelling at each other for being crazy, and we're not really getting any progress in learning about what I need in my love life. And then my soft-spoken 88-year-old grandma started to speak, and everyone went quiet, and she explained to me that I need a nice girl, not too pretty, very smart, good with people, social so you will do things, sense of humor because you have a good sense of humor. And I described why was her advice so much better than everybody else's. I think one of the reasons is that she's big data, right? So grandmas and grandpas throughout history have had access to more data points than anybody else, and they've been able to correlate larger patterns than anybody else has because they've been around longer. And that's why they've been such an important source of wisdom historically.
The problem, of course, as you also point out, is that it's very hard to disentangle your personal experiences from what actually happens in the world. And in your grandmother's case, she actually had a very specific piece of relationship advice about the kind of person you should want. And some of that might not actually be backed up by the empirical evidence.
Yeah, well, my grandma has told me on multiple occasions that it's important to have a common set of friends and a partner. So she lived in a small apartment in Queens, New York with my grandfather, and every evening they'd go outside and gossip with their neighbors. And she thought that was a big part in why their relationship worked. But actually, recently, computer scientists have analyzed data from Facebook, and they can actually look when people are in relationships and when they're out of relationships, and try to predict what factors of a relationship make it more likely to last. One of the things they tested was having a common group of friends. Some partners on Facebook share pretty much the same friend group, and some people have totally isolated friend groups. And they found, contrary to my grandmother's advice, that having a separate social circle is actually a positive predictor of a relationship lasting.
And so, of course, the risk of trusting the individual is that the individual's intuition about what worked for his or her life might not work for everyone else.
That's right. I think we tend to get biased by our own situation. Data scientists have a phrase called weighting data. Some data points get extra weight in our models, and our intuition gives too much weight to our own experience, and we tend to assume that what worked for us will work for others as well, and that's frequently not the case.
Many companies know that we don't really understand ourselves. When we come back, we look at how companies are using big data to predict what we're going to do before we know it ourselves. We'll also ask, if sites like Google can use data to forecast whether you're going to get a serious illness, should they give you that information? Stay with us.
Hi, this is David Green. I hope you'll start your day tomorrow with Up First. It's the morning news podcast from NPR. The most important details about the biggest stories to get you ready for the day. Wake up with Up First tomorrow morning on the NPR One app and also wherever you listen to podcasts.
This is Hidden Brain. I'm Shankar Vedantam. We're speaking today with former Google data scientist Seth Stephens-Davidowitz about the research in his book, Everybody Lies: Big Data, New Data, and what the internet can tell us about who we really are. Netflix used to ask users what kind of movies they wanted to watch. Seth says eventually the company realized that asking this kind of question was a complete waste of time.
Yeah, initially Netflix would ask people what they want to view in the future so they could queue up the movies that they said. And if you ask people, what are you going to want to watch tomorrow or this weekend, people are very aspirational. They want to watch documentaries or about World War II or avant-garde French films. But then when Saturday or Sunday comes around, they want to watch the same lowbrow comedies that they've always watched. So Netflix realized they had to just ignore what people told them and use their algorithms to figure out what they'd actually want to watch.
So one of the things that's intriguing about what you just said is I don't think it's actually the case that people were lying to Netflix when they said they wanted to watch the avant-garde film. They actually genuinely probably aspired to do that. It might actually be that big data understands people better than they understand themselves.
Yeah, probably even more common than lying to other people is lying to ourselves, particularly when we're trying to predict what we're going to do in 2 or 3 days. We tend to assume that we're going to go to the gym more than we go to the gym, or eat better than we actually will eat, or watch more intellectual stuff than we actually will watch. So the algorithms can correct for this over-optimism that we all tend to share.
When you look at a company like Facebook, which has access to these, huge amounts of data about us and what we like and whom we like in our relationships, you have to wonder how the company is using this data in all kinds of different ways. I remember Facebook got into some hot water a couple of years ago because they ran an experiment that seemed to be manipulating how people feel. And of course, there was a huge outcry about the experiment at the time. And since then, there hasn't been very much reported about what Facebook is doing. But I suspect that it might just be because Facebook is no longer telling us what it's doing, but it's still doing it anyway.
Every major tech company now runs lots and lots of what are called A/B tests, which are little experiments where you put people into 2 different groups, a treatment and control group, and you show one group one version of your site and the other group another version of the site, and you see which version gets the most clicks or the most views. This is really exploded in the tech industry.
There are many, many instances where companies are now using big data against us. Banks and other financial institutions are using clues from big data to decide who shouldn't get a loan.
I think it's an area of big concern. So I talk about a study in the book where they studied a peer-to-peer lending site, and they studied the text that people used in their requests for loans. And you can figure out just from what people say in their loans how likely they are to pay back. And there are some strange correlations. For example, if you mention the word God, you're 2.2 times less likely to pay back, 2.2 times more likely to default. And this does get eerie. Are you really supposed to be penalized if you mention God in a loan application? That would seem to be really wrong, even evil, right, to penalize somebody for a religious preference. Basically, everything's correlated with everything, right? So just about anything anybody does is going to have some predictive power for other things they do. And the legal system is really not set up for a world in which companies potentially can mine correlations over just about everything anybody does in their life.
I was thinking about an ethical issue. I'm not sure if necessarily this is a legal issue, but you mentioned in the book that, if someone is Googling, I've been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, what should I do? It's reasonable to assume that this person has been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. But if you collect all of the people who are Googling what to do about their diagnosis with pancreatic cancer and then work backwards to see what they've been searching for in the weeks and months prior to their diagnosis, you can discover some pretty amazing things.
Yeah, this is a study that researchers used Microsoft Bing data. They looked at people who searched for just diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and then similar people who never made such a search. And then they looked at all the health symptoms they had made in the lead up to either a diagnosis or no diagnosis. And they found that there were very, very clear patterns of symptoms that were far more likely to suggest a future diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. For example, they found that searching for indigestion and then abdominal pain was evidence of pancreatic cancer, while searching for just indigestion without abdominal pain meant a person was much more unlikely to have pancreatic cancer. And that's a really, really subtle pattern in symptoms, right? Like a time series of one symptom followed by another symptom is evidence of a potential disease. It really shows, I think, the power of this data, where you can really tease out very subtle patterns and symptoms and figure out which ones are potentially threatening and which ones are benign.
So here's the ethical question. Once you establish that there is this correlation, that you sort of say, I have a universe of people who clearly have pancreatic cancer, and I work backwards through their search history, and I detect these patterns that no one had thought to look at before, that say these particular kinds of search terms seem to be correlated with people who go on to have the diagnosis versus these search terms that do not go on to predict a diagnosis. So does a company like Microsoft now have an obligation to tell people who are Googling for these combinations of search terms, look, you might actually need to get checked out. You might actually need to go see a doctor because, of course, if you can be diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, 4 weeks earlier, you have a much better chance of survival than if you have to wait for a month.
I lean in the direction of yes. Some people would not lean in that direction. And it could be a little creepy if Google, right below the button, I feel lucky, you may have pancreatic cancer. It's not exactly the most friendly thing to see on a website. But personally, if I had some sort of symptom pattern that suggested I may have a disease and there was a chance of curing it if I was told, I'd want to know that. It's just another example that really the ethical and legal framework that we've set up is not necessarily prepared for big data.
Seth Stephens-Davidowitz is a former data scientist at Google and the author of the book Everybody Lies: Big Data, New Data, and What the Internet Can Tell Us About Who We Really Are. Seth, thank you for joining me today on Hidden Brain.
Thanks so much for having me, Shankar.
Have you ever talked to your computer, cursed it for making a mistake?
PC load letter? What does that mean?
Have you ever argued with the traffic directions you get from Google Maps or Waze?
Starting route to Grover's Mill Road. Head north on...
Have you ever looked at a Roomba cleaning the floor on the other side of the room and told it, please come over to this side? Turn left. Left!
It just ran itself right over the edge.
Robots and artificial intelligence are playing an ever larger role in all of our lives. Of course, this is not the role that science fiction once imagined.
It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear.
Robots bent on our destruction remain the stuff of movies like Terminator. And robot sentience is still an idea that's far off in the future. But there's a lot we're learning about smart machines, And there's a lot that smart machines are teaching us about how we connect with the world around us and with each other. My guest today has spent a lot of time thinking about how we interact with smart machines and how those interactions might change the way we relate to one another. Kate Darling is a research specialist at the MIT Media Lab. She joined us recently in front of a live audience at the Hotel Jerome in Aspen, Colorado, as part of the Aspen Ideas Festival. Also on stage was a robot, a green robot dinosaur about the size of a small dog, known as a Pleo. It's going to be part of this conversation, but before we get to that, here's Kate. Kate, welcome to Hidden Brain.
Thank you for having me.
You found that there is an interesting point in the relationship between humans and machines, and that point comes when we give a machine a name. I understand that you have 3 of these Pleo dinosaurs at your home. Can you tell me some of the names that you have given to your robots?
Yes. So the very first one I bought, I named Yochai after Yochai Benkler, who's a Harvard professor who's done some work in intellectual property and other areas that I've always admired. And the second one I adopted after I filmed a Canadian documentary where the show host had to name the robot, and he gave the robot the same name he had, which was Peter. So the second one has a boring name. And then the third one is named Mr. Spaghetti. I don't know if people outside of Boston are familiar with this, but the Boston public transportation system, they wanted to crowdsource a name for their mascot dog. And the internet decided that the dog should be named Mr. Spaghetti, and of course they refused to do that and named the dog Hunter. So Mr. Spaghetti became a big thing in Boston for a while. It was people were very outraged about this, and so I named my Pleo, my third one, Mr. Spaghetti.
I understand that companies actually have found that if you sell a robot with the name of the robot on the box, it changes the way people will interact with that robot than if you just said, this is a dinosaur.
So this is not, I don't have any data on this, but yes, I have talked to companies who feel that it helps with adoption and trust of the technology. Even very, very simple robots like boxes on wheels that deliver medicine in hospitals, if you give them a little nameplate that says Betsy, their understanding is that people are a little bit more forgiving of the robot. So instead of this stupid machine doesn't work, they'll say, oh, Betsy made a mistake.
And I'm wondering if you've spent time thinking about why this happens. At some level, if I came up to you at home and I said, Kate, is Mr. Spaghetti alive? You would almost certainly tell me, no, Mr. Spaghetti is not alive. I assume you don't think Mr. Spaghetti is alive, right?
No.
Okay. So, given that you know that Mr. Spaghetti is not alive, why do you think giving him a name changes your relationship to him?
With robots in particular, it's combined with just our general tendency to anthropomorphize these things, and we're also primed by science fiction and pop culture to give robots names and view them as entities with personalities. And it's more than just the name, right? I mean, robots move around in a way that seems autonomous to us. We respond to that type of physical movement. Our brains will project intent onto it. So I think robots are the perfect mixture of something that we will very willingly treat with human qualities or lifelike qualities.
All right, so we have this wonderful little prop in front of us. It's a Pleo dinosaur. I want you to tell me a little bit about the Pleo dinosaur, how it works, and how you come to own 3 of them, Kate. What is the dinosaur? What does it do?
It's basically an expensive toy. I bought the first one, I think, in 2007. There we go, it's awake. They have a lot of motors and touch sensors, and they have an infrared camera and microphones. So they're pretty cool pieces of technology for a toy, and that's initially why I bought one, because I was fascinated by everything that it can do. Like, if it starts walking around, it can walk to the edge of the table, it can look down, measure the distance to the floor, it knows that there's a drop, and it'll get scared and walk backwards. And then they go through different life phases, adolescent and fully grown, and it'll have moods. And
So I think what we should do, we bought the robot at Hidden Brain a couple of weeks ago. We haven't had a chance to give it a name yet. And I thought we should actually reserve the honors for this evening where we're talking to Kate and see if Kate wants to try and name this dinosaur, since she cares about dinosaurs so much. I was looking up Kate's Twitter feed this morning. I understand that you're going to have a baby soon. Congratulations.
Yes, I don't have a name for that either.
Okay. Just FYI, she sometimes refers to the baby as baby bot, so just for whatever that's worth. And one retweet that you had on your Twitter feed cracked me up. It said, "You don't really know how many people you don't like until you start trying to pick baby names."
Yeah, that's a quote from my husband.
So I don't want you to tell me, you apparently haven't yet picked your baby's name, so do you have any choices, top choices? Is there a spare name that you might care to give the dinosaur?
Well, the problem is we've had a girl's name picked out for years, and now we're having a boy, and we don't even have any contenders.
No contenders. What would have been your favorite girl's name if you had had a girl?
Well, so when I first started dating my now husband, he at some point said, if I ever had a daughter, I already know what I would name her. And I was like, oh, really? We're going to fight about this one. And he said, yeah, I would name her Samantha and Sam for short, because Sam is kind of gender neutral. And I was like, oh, I really love that. So that one was picked out very easily.
All right, since you're not having a girl, you're going to have a boy, would you mind if you considered naming the dinosaur Samantha? How would you feel about that?
Oh, that would be awesome. We should name the dinosaur Samantha.
All right, so henceforth, this dinosaur will be called Samantha, or Sam for short. Now, some time ago, Kate conducted a very interesting experiment with the Pleo dinosaurs. And to sort of show how this works, I have a second prop here, which is under the table.
Uh-oh.
It's a hammer, a large hammer, which we borrowed from the hotel. Now, as you all know, the dinosaur is obviously not alive. It's just cloth and plastic and a battery and wires. It has a name, of course, Samantha, but it isn't alive in any sense of the term. And so, Kate, I'm going to actually give you the hammer.
Oh, no.
And I think we might have a little board underneath the table here. We're going to place the dinosaur on a board. Kate, would you consider destroying Samantha?
No.
It's just a machine.
I only make other people do that. I don't do it myself.
You wouldn't even consider harming the dinosaur?
Well, so my problem is that I already know the results of our research, and that would say something about me as a person, so I'm going to say no, I'm not willing to do it.
Kate Darling is a research specialist at the MIT Media Lab. When we come back, I'll ask her about that research she references in which she asked volunteers to smash a robot dinosaur.
Support for this NPR podcast and the following message come from the Ford Foundation, working with visionaries on the front lines of social change worldwide to address inequality in all its forms. Learn more at fordfoundation.org.